The wind came down off the Bitterroot peaks like something alive, like something with teeth, and it carried on its back the smell of pine sap and old snow and gunpowder. Wyatt Hollister stood at the edge of the timber line with a Winchester rifle still warm in his hands, and at his feet lay 3 men in buffalo coats, their blood steaming in the cold January air. The snow around them was painted dark, and the moon overhead hung pale and indifferent, the way the moon always hangs over dying men. A voice came from the trees behind him, low and steady. Silas. His brother had a way of moving through the woods that made no sound at all, the way a wolf moves, the way a thought moves. "There are 2 more, brother. They are running toward the cabin." Wyatt spit into the snow at his feet and watched the steam rise from the wet patch. "Then let Cole have them." The screen of memory cut to black, and the wind that howled through the Bitterroot kept howling, and somewhere far below the mountain, in the lights of a forgotten city, 3 months earlier, a girl named Eleanor Whitmore was kneeling on a cold stone floor with a scrub brush in her raw red hands, and she did not yet know that her life was about to be sold for $300 in American silver. The orphanage of St. Mary in the city of St. Louis sat at the bend of a street where the wind always smelled of coal smoke and slaughterhouse runoff. The building itself was made of red brick, blackened by 20 years of soot, and inside its walls the air was always cold, even when the summer sun beat down outside, because cold was a virtue there, and warmth was a luxury that had to be earned through prayer and work and silence. Eleanor was 19 years old that October of 1884. She had hair the color of a copper kettle held too long over a flame, hair that flared red in the morning light and burned gold in the evening hair that Sister Agnes had ordered her to keep bound under a black wool wimple at all hours, even in sleep. Her eyes were green. Her skin was pale and dusted faintly with freckles across the bridge of her nose, the kind of freckles a country mother might have kissed. Once upon a time, the kind of freckles that no one in this brick building had ever called pretty. She had been 6 years old when her father and mother died in the cotton mill fire of 1871. 13 years had passed since then, 13 years of waking before dawn, of saying the rosary on cold knees, of scrubbing floors that did not need scrubbing because Sister Agnes believed that idle hands invited the devil into the soul. 13 years of being told that her hair was a snare, that her face was a temptation, that the body God had given her was a thing to be hidden, punished, tamed. But the body did not listen. The body had grown anyway. By her 17th year, she had become the kind of woman that men in the streets of St. Louis turned their heads to watch when she passed by, carrying a basket of bread for the convent kitchen. The men did not whistle because Sister Agnes walked beside her with a face like a hatchet. But Eleanor saw the way they looked, and she did not know whether to feel ashamed or to feel for the first time in her life that she might possess something the world wanted. On the morning that everything changed, she was washing the floor of the chapel when Sister Agnes came for her. The old nun's footsteps were sharp and final, like the click of a rifle bolt being drawn back, and Eleanor knew before she looked up that something was wrong. "Eleanor, stand. Wash your hands. There is a gentleman waiting in the office." She stood. She washed her hands. She did not ask questions because in that house, questions were not welcome. She followed Sister Agnes down the long stone corridor where the windows were too high to see out of, and she stepped into the office, and she saw the man. He was small. That was the first thing she noticed. Small and tidy, dressed in a black wool suit with a silver watch chain across his vest, his hair combed flat against his skull with some kind of perfumed oil. He held his hat in his lap. He looked at her the way a butcher looks at a side of beef, weighing it, pricing it, calculating. "Eleanor," Sister Agnes said, "this is Mr. Bartholomew Finch. He has come from Chicago. He represents a marriage agency for gentlemen of the Western Territories. A Mr. Hollister of Montana has paid $300 for your contract. You will travel by rail to Helena next week. The matter is decided." Eleanor felt her throat close. She had no rights. The orphanage owned her until her 21st birthday, 2 years away. She had no money, no family, no place to run. She looked at Mr. Finch, and she looked at Sister Agnes, and she nodded the way she had been trained to nod, with her eyes on the floor and her hands folded in front of her apron. "Yes, sister." That night, when the dormitory was dark and the other girls were asleep, Sister Agnes came to her cot and pressed an envelope into her hands. The envelope was sealed with red wax, and the wax bore the impression of a small mountain. "Read it. He insisted you read it before you decide, though there is nothing to decide." The old nun left, and Eleanor lit the stub of a candle she kept hidden under her mattress, and she opened the letter with hands that trembled not from fear, but from something closer to wonder. No one had ever written her a letter before. No one had ever cared what she thought. The handwriting was hard and square, the kind of handwriting a man makes with a pen held in a fist that has known more axes than ink. "Eleanor Whitmore, my name is Wyatt Hollister. I am 33 years old. I live at Bear Creek in the Bitterroot Range of Montana Territory, along with my 2 younger brothers Silas and Cole. We trap fur and we hold a parcel of land. I will not promise you romance. The life I have lived has burned that out of me. But I will promise you a roof, food in the larder, and protection against any man who would harm you. One of the 3 of us will marry you. The choice is yours when you arrive. If you find that none of us suit, I will pay your fare back to wherever you wish to go. You have my word, and a Hollister's word is the only currency that matters in this country. Wyatt Hollister." Eleanor read the letter 3 times. She read it until the candle burned down to a pool of wax. She read the line that said, "The choice is yours," and she pressed her hand against her heart, because in 19 years no one had ever offered her a choice about anything. She slept that night with the letter pressed flat against her ribs beneath the rough cotton of her nightdress, and she dreamed of a mountain she had never seen and 3 men whose faces she could not yet imagine. She did not know that the letter was a lie. She did not know that Wyatt Hollister had never written her, had never heard her name, had never put pen to paper for any woman in 9 long years. She did not know that the letter had been forged by a clerk in Chicago for the price of $50, and that the man who had paid for the forgery was not a husband seeking a wife, but a banker seeking revenge. His name was Harrison Thorne. He was 60 years old, and he owned the largest bank in Helena, Montana, and he had spent 5 years dreaming of the night he would watch the 3 Hollister brothers bleed into the snow of Bear Creek. He had a partner in this dream, a railroad baron from Chicago named Jeremiah Cobb, a man who had built a fortune by laying steel rails across the bones of broken homesteaders. Cobb was 50 years old, and he wore his hair pomaded back, and he kept 3 mistresses in 3 different cities, and he had seen Eleanor Whitmore once at a charity supper in St. Louis, and he had decided that she would be his 4th. The plan was simple. It was the kind of plan that simple men always think is clever. Eleanor would be sent west on the train to Helena. She would be carrying a forged letter that the Hollister brothers had never seen. Cobb's men would intercept her at the station. They would tell her that the brothers were waiting at Bear Creek and they would lead her up into the mountains as bait. The brothers would see the woman, and they would come down to the town to make wedding arrangements, and somewhere on that long road between the cabin and Helena, 20 hired guns would close in and end the Hollister line for good. After the killing was done, Eleanor would belong to Cobb. He had already had a dress measured for her in Chicago. He had already chosen the room in his Lakeshore Drive mansion where he would keep her. Eleanor did not know any of this. She knew only that a man named Wyatt had written her a letter, and that in that letter he had promised her a choice, and that for the first time in 19 years she carried a piece of paper that felt like a key. The train pulled out of St. Louis on a wet, gray morning of late October, when the air smelled of river mud and coal and the first frost of the coming winter. Eleanor sat by the window in a third-class car with her small steamer trunk at her feet and her hands folded in her lap. She wore the gray wool dress the orphanage had given her and a black bonnet tied tight under her chin, and the letter was folded into the lining of her bodice where she could feel it scrape softly against her skin every time she drew breath. The car was crowded with men in stained coats and women holding crying children, and the smell of unwashed bodies and tobacco and damp wool. She did not speak to anyone. She watched the country roll past the window. She watched the green hills of Missouri give way to the wide, flat plains of Kansas, and the plains give way to the broken country of Wyoming, where the rocks stood up red and ancient against the sky. 2 days passed. 3. The train climbed, and the air grew thinner, and she saw mountains for the first time in her life, peaks already white with the early snow of late October, and her breath caught in her throat at the sight of them. On the 4th morning, an old man with one leg sat down across from her. His other leg was a wooden stump strapped to his hip with leather, and he carried a polished cane carved from oak. His beard was the color of dirty snow, and his eyes were blue and quick and kind. "Forgive an old soldier his manners, miss. My name is Tobias Whitfield. Most folks just call me Old Toby. I notice you have been riding alone since St. Joseph, and I thought you might appreciate a friendly word." Eleanor hesitated. Then she nodded. "Eleanor Whitmore. I am traveling to Helena." The old man's eyebrows lifted. He set down his cane. "Helena. Now there is a town. May I ask what business takes a young lady such as yourself to that part of the territory?" She looked at her hands. She thought of the letter pressed against her ribs. "I am to be married to a Mr. Hollister of Bear Creek." Old Toby went very still. The smile on his face did not quite leave, but it changed. It became something careful. He leaned forward and lowered his voice. "Miss Whitmore, I do not wish to alarm you, but I have spent 30 years in the Montana Territory, and I have heard the name Hollister more times than I can count. The eldest brother Wyatt rode in the Northern Plains campaign back in 76 and 77 after the bad business at the Little Bighorn. He was a hard man, but a fair one. His brothers Silas and Cole, they are cut from the same wood. Honor is the only church those boys attend. But miss, I have to tell you a thing, because if I did not tell you, I would not sleep tonight. There is a family in Helena that has sworn to wipe the Hollister name from the earth, the Thornes. It is an old wound and a bad one. If you are walking into Bear Creek as a Hollister bride, you are walking into the middle of a war. I would have you know that before the train stops." Eleanor felt the cold come down through her chest then. She felt the letter against her ribs, and she felt the words of the old soldier settling into her bones. "Thank you, Mr. Whitfield. I will remember." He tipped his hat and said no more. But before he limped off at the next stop, He pressed a small folded paper into her hand. "That is the address of my daughter in Helena. If you ever find yourself in trouble in that town, you go to her. You tell her old Toby sent you. She will not ask questions." The train rolled on. Eleanor watched the mountains grow larger, and she pressed old Toby's paper into the lining of her bodice next to the letter. She did not know yet what the paper would mean. She did not know yet that within 72 hours she would be running for her life through a forest she could not name, but she felt a cold wind in her bones that the train windows could not explain, and she sat very still, and she waited. The train arrived at Helena under a sky the color of old pewter. The platform was crowded with miners and merchants and women in heavy traveling cloaks, and porters shouting in 3 languages, and somewhere a horse screamed in a stockyard down the line. Eleanor stepped down from the car with her trunk in one hand, and she stood on the boards looking left and looking right, waiting for someone to come for her. No one came. She waited an hour. She waited 2. The crowd thinned. The porter stopped shouting. The pewter sky turned darker, and a cold rain began to fall, and she still stood there with her trunk and her gray wool dress, and her heart began to beat in a way she did not like. Then a small man in a black suit stepped out of the depot office and walked toward her. He took off his hat. It was Bartholomew Finch. "Miss Whitmore, forgive the delay. Mr. Hollister and his brothers are out at the cabin tonight hunting. They will come down for you in the morning. I have arranged a room at the Empire Hotel. You will be quite comfortable there." Eleanor looked at him. There was something in his eyes that she had not seen in St. Louis, a kind of fevered brightness, the way a man looks when he is about to win a hand of cards he should not be holding. "Thank you, Mr. Finch." He took her trunk. He led her down a muddy street to a 2-story building with a faded sign that said Empire Hotel in cracked gold paint. He paid the clerk. He showed her to a room on the 2nd floor at the end of a long hall, and the door of the room was thin, and the walls of the room were thinner, and when he closed the door behind her, she heard the lock click on the outside as well as the inside. She stood alone in the room. She listened. Voices. Mr. Finch in the next room, and another voice lower harder. A man she did not know. Eleanor took off her boots so that she could walk silently across the floor. She pressed her ear to the wall. "Cobb wired this morning. Confirmed. Zeke and 4 men ride up to Bear Creek at first light tomorrow. They tell the brothers the woman is here. The brothers come down to the town to arrange the wedding. We close the road behind them. 20 guns. It will be over by sundown. The girl, she rides on with Zeke. Cobb will take delivery in Chicago by month's end." Silence. Then a low laugh. "He will pay the bonus once the brothers are dead, not before. Make sure the girl is unharmed. Cobb wants her exactly as she is, untouched. He has been very particular about that." Eleanor stepped back from the wall. Her knees gave out and she sank onto the edge of the bed, and she pressed both hands over her mouth because if she cried out, she would die. She was the bait. She had been the bait from the beginning. The letter had been a lie. The choice had been a lie. There was no Wyatt Hollister waiting for her, only 3 men she had never met who were about to be murdered because of her. And after the murdering was done, she would belong to a stranger in Chicago who had measured her for a dress the way a butcher measures a cow. She sat on the bed for a full minute, and in that minute, something inside her that had been small and silent for 19 years stood up and looked around. Something her parents had given her in the cotton mill fire and in the years before. Something the orphanage had not been able to scrub out of her with all its lye soap and all its prayers. She would not be bait. She rose. She did not light the lamp. She moved across the room in her stocking feet, and she packed her trunk silent as a thought, and she opened the window. The window looked down onto the slanted, shingled roof of a stable below, and beyond the stable was a yard, and beyond the yard was an alley, and beyond the alley was the whole black of the Montana night. She climbed out. She slid down the shingles on her belly with her trunk dragging behind her by its leather strap, and she dropped the 8 feet to the muddy yard with a soft, wet sound, and she stood there in the rain with her gray dress already ruined. The stable was unlocked. She slipped inside. There were 6 horses in the stalls, and a tack room with saddles and bridles hung on the wall, and a small kerosene lantern burning low. She chose the smallest horse, a chestnut mare with a white blaze, because the smallest horse would be the easiest to mount. She did not take the saddle because the saddle would take too long to cinch. She took only a bridle and a thin wool blanket. She had ridden before. The orphanage had kept a pony for the children's chores. She had ridden bareback when no one was looking. She led the mare out of the stable and into the alley. She walked her 3 blocks before she mounted because hooves on cobblestone make a sound that wakes a town. When she finally swung up onto the mare's back, the rain had soaked her to the skin and her teeth were chattering, but she felt more alive than she had ever felt in 19 years. She did not know the way to Bear Creek. She knew only that it lay west of Helena, up in the Bitterroot Range somewhere among those white peaks she had seen from the train. She turned the mare's head west, and she dug her heels into the chestnut's ribs, and she rode out of Helena into the black of the mountain night. She rode all night. She rode through pine forests where the trees grew so thick that the rain did not reach the ground, and the rain turned to wet snow as she climbed, and she rode across stony creeks where the mare slipped and almost fell, and she rode up switchback trails where the drop on the right-hand side was a black nothing into a canyon she could not see. She fell off twice. She got back on twice. The cold went into her bones and stayed there. By dawn, her hands had gone numb on the reins. By mid-morning, she was lost, and she knew it. She had taken a fork in the trail 2 hours back, and she had no way of knowing whether she had chosen the right one. The mare was tiring. The mare had not been fed since the night before, and neither had Eleanor, and neither of them had slept. She came down out of a stand of lodgepole pines into a clearing where the first hard frost of the season had silvered the grass, and she saw far away across a long meadow a thin gray ribbon of wood smoke rising into the cold blue sky. Smoke meant a cabin. A cabin meant a man. A man might be Wyatt Hollister, or a man might be one of Cobb's killers, or a man might be a stranger who would help her or harm her, but smoke was the only thing she had left in the world to ride toward, and so she rode. The cabin came into view a quarter-mile later. It was set against a granite cliff, 2 stories of hand-hewn logs, with a stone chimney and a wide porch and a barn out behind. A blacksmith's forge stood beside the barn. 3 horses grazed in a fenced pasture. The smoke came from the chimney. The cabin looked like something a man had built to last 100 years and to defend against any weather and any enemy that the mountain might send. Eleanor was 40 yards from the porch when the dogs came. There were 3 of them. Wolfhound mixed with something larger. The kind of dog you breed up in the high country to fight bears and cougars. They came around the side of the cabin in a low, silent rush, and Eleanor's mare reared, and Eleanor came off the back of the horse and hit the frozen ground hard, and she lay there in the mud unable to breathe, while the 3 dogs circled her with their teeth showing. The cabin door banged open. 3 men stepped out onto the porch. They came out in a wedge formation the way men come out who have done it many times before. The way men come out who expect to die on their own front porch one day and want to be ready for it. The man in the center was the tallest. He wore a black bear coat that hung to his knees, and his beard was black and full, and his eyes were a cold gray that seemed to take the temperature of everything they touched. He held a Winchester rifle across his body. The man on his left was almost as tall and quieter, with brown hair tied back at the neck and a long, pale scar running down his right cheek into his beard. The man on his right was the youngest, with hair the color of dark honey and blue eyes that seemed to find amusement even in a moment that had no amusement in it. His hand rested easy on the butt of a Colt revolver at his hip. The man in the center spoke. His voice was deep, and it carried the way a stone carries when it falls into a deep well. "Who are you?" It was not a question. It was a demand. Eleanor pushed herself up onto her elbows in the mud. Her gray dress was black with wet. Her hair had come loose from her bonnet, and the copper of it spilled down her shoulder, and she felt the eyes of 3 strange men on her, and she felt suddenly, terribly, that she was a woman in a wilderness, with nothing in the world to bargain with. She drew herself up to her knees. She lifted her chin. "My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I have come from St. Louis. I was told that I am to marry one of the Hollister brothers. I have a letter." The youngest brother laughed. It was not a kind laugh. It was the laugh of a man who has heard too many lies in his lifetime to be patient with one more. "Marry one of us. That is a fine joke for a Tuesday morning. We have not ordered a bride from any agency lady. We have not written any letter. Whoever sent you up this mountain sent you on a fool's errand." Eleanor's hand went to her bodice. Her fingers were so cold she could barely make them work. She drew the letter out and held it up in the rain. "Then read this. Please. Just read it." The man in the center, the eldest, came down off the porch. The dogs parted around him like water around a stone. He took the letter from her hand without speaking, and he opened it, and he read it once, and his jaw tightened. He passed the letter to the brother with the scar. That brother read it, and he said nothing, and he passed the letter to the youngest. The youngest read it, and he laughed again, but this time the laugh had no humor in it at all. It was the laugh men make when they understand that someone has tried to kill them. "Wyatt, that is not your hand." The eldest Wyatt looked at Eleanor. His gray eyes had gone very still. "That is not my hand. I did not write this. Who gave this to you?" "A man in St. Louis. Mr. Bartholomew Finch. He said he represented your agency. He took $300 from the orphanage where I was kept. He put me on the train. Last night in Helena, I overheard him speaking with another man. They said that tomorrow they would send 4 men up here to bring me to Bear Creek, and that you would come down to Helena to make wedding arrangements, and that 20 guns would be waiting on the road. They said I was bait. They said when you were dead, I would be taken to Chicago and given to a man named Cobb. So I ran. I rode all night. I am here to warn you." Wyatt looked at her for a long time. The rain ran down the brim of his black hat. He did not blink. "Cobb," the brother with the scar, spoke for the first time. His voice was low and dry like wood that had been left out in the sun too long. "Thorne. It is Thorne, brother. Cobb is the money, but Thorne is the hand." The youngest brother had stopped laughing. 5 years. 5 years and the old wolf finally moves. Wyatt looked at Eleanor for a long time. He set down the forged letter. He spoke slowly the way a man speaks when he is dragging an old corpse out of a deep grave. "Miss Whitmore, you are owed the truth, since the truth has put you on this porch in the mud. Harrison Thorne is not our father. Our father was Eli Hollister. He came to this mountain in 1853, and he built that cabin with his own hands, and he died of the lung sickness in the winter of 1867. He was 42 years old. Our mother was Sarah. She was 29 when our father died, and she had 3 sons under her roof, and a parcel of land she did not know how to hold alone. Harrison Thorne was the banker in Helena. He came up the mountain to offer her a loan. He stayed for the night. He stayed for many nights. Within the year, she was carrying his child, and within 2 years, she had married him, because in this country, a woman with land and 3 sons does what she must do. The child she bore him was Beauregard. He grew up in this cabin alongside us. He called my father's name on his lips, and he ate at my father's table, and he learned to ride my father's horses. We treated him as a brother. We were fools. In 1879, he forged my father's signature on a deed transferring the family mine to Harrison's bank. When I discovered it, I burned the deed in front of both of them, and I drove them off this land at the point of a rifle. Our mother died of grief 6 months later. Harrison swore he would put us all in the ground for it. That was 5 years ago. Now you understand why your letter has us cleaning rifles. Eleanor felt the tears begin to rise, and she pushed them down because she would not cry in front of these 3. She reached up to her throat, and she pulled out the small silver crucifix that her father had hung there on the morning of the cotton mill fire, the only thing she had left of him in all the world. I rode for 24 hours through a forest I have never seen to warn 3 men I have never met. I do not know you. I have no reason to lie to you. If you do not believe me, then shoot me where I kneel, and the dogs can have what is left. But for the love of God, do not let those 4 men come up this mountain tomorrow morning to take me back to Helena, because if they do, you will follow them, and you will die on that road, and I cannot have that on my soul, not for the rest of my life, not ever. The wind blew. The dogs were silent. The brother with the scar took 2 slow steps forward and stopped beside Wyatt. He looked at Eleanor for a long moment, and then he reached out and pulled the wool blanket from the back of her fallen mare, and he came down off the porch, and he draped it around her shoulders. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Wyatt nodded once. Silas, bring her inside. Cole, saddle the gray. I want eyes on the trail down to Helena before the sun sets. I want to know if anyone followed her up. If anyone did, I want to know how many and what they ride and how well armed they are. The youngest brother, Cole, swung his eyes from Wyatt to Eleanor and back again, and a slow, strange smile pulled at the corner of his mouth. Well, brother, if she is telling the truth, she just saved our lives, and if she is lying, we will know it within the week. Either way, she is the most interesting Tuesday morning we have had since the Gray Bear. Cole tipped his hat to Eleanor with a mockery so faint it might have been respect, and he stepped down off the porch and walked toward the barn with his long, lazy stride. Silas put one large, warm hand under her elbow and helped her to her feet, and she was so cold and so tired that she nearly fell into him, and he caught her without a word and walked her up onto the porch and into the warmth of the cabin. The inside of the cabin smelled of pine smoke and tanned leather and coffee that had been on the stove since morning. The main room was wide and low-ceilinged, with a great stone hearth at one end and a long plank table at the other, and a black bear hide on the floor between them. A flight of pine stairs climbed to a loft. 3 doors led off the main room, and Eleanor understood without being told that those were the bedrooms of the brothers. The walls were hung with rifles and traps and snowshoes and an old cavalry saber whose scabbard was scarred with nicks. There were no curtains on the windows. There were no flowers in any vase. It was a house built by men who did not expect any woman ever to live in it. Silas sat her down by the hearth. He brought her a cup of coffee so black and so hot it burned her tongue, and then he brought her a quilt and a clean dry shirt of his own, and he turned his back and tended the fire while she changed behind a folded screen of pine planks. The shirt was so large on her that it hung past her knees. She wrapped herself in the quilt and sat on the bear hide and stared into the flames, and she felt her body begin to shake the way a body shakes after the danger has passed. Silas sat down across from her. He did not speak. He simply watched the fire. After a long while, he said in a voice no louder than the popping of the wood, "You are safe here tonight, Miss Whitmore. Whatever else happens, tonight you are safe." Eleanor closed her eyes, and a single tear slid down her cheek, and she did not wipe it away. Wyatt came in an hour later, stamping the snow off his boots. He went to a cabinet against the far wall, and he took down a brown clay jug and 3 tin cups, and he poured a measure of whiskey into each, and he handed one to Silas, and he handed one to Eleanor, and he kept the third for himself. "Drink it, all of it. You will not catch a chill in this house." Eleanor drank. The whiskey burned a road down the inside of her chest. She coughed. Wyatt almost smiled but did not quite. He sat down on a wooden bench across from her and rested his rifle across his knees. "Miss Whitmore, I will be plain with you. We are not gentlemen of the parlor, my brothers and me. We do not know what to do with a young woman in this house. But I gave my word a long time ago that I would not turn away anyone who came to my door in honest trouble, and I believe you came in honest trouble. So you will stay tonight. You will stay tomorrow. Silas will ride to Helena tonight under cover of dark, and he will find this Mr. Finch, and he will learn the truth of what you have told us. If your story holds, we will know what we are facing by the end of the week. If your story does not hold you, and I will have a different conversation. Do you understand me?" Eleanor nodded. Her throat was too tight to speak. "Good. Now eat. There is venison stew on the stove. Then sleep. The bedroom on the right is empty. It belonged to my mother. She has been gone 15 years. The bed has clean linen. No one will trouble you." He stood. He walked toward the door. At the threshold, he turned back. "Miss Whitmore, one more thing. If you have lied to me and 3 more of my brothers' lives are spent because of it, there is no place on this earth where you will be able to hide from me. I want that to be clear between us before either of us closes our eyes tonight." Eleanor met his gray eyes across the firelight. "I have not lied to you, Mr. Hollister. I swear it on my father's grave." He held her eyes for a long moment, then he nodded once and he went out into the rain. The door closed behind him, and the wind came in off the mountain, and somewhere far below in the lights of Helena, a man named Bartholomew Finch was opening a bottle of celebratory bourbon, and a man named Zeke Rollins was oiling his pistol by lamplight, and a man named Harrison Thorne was sitting in a leather chair in front of a banker's fire, smiling at the thought that, by this time tomorrow, the Hollister name would begin its final journey out of the world. None of them knew that a copper-haired girl from a St. Louis orphanage had already broken their plan in half. None of them knew that the bait had thrown the hook and was running free. None of them knew that high in the Bitterroot in a cabin built to last 100 years, 3 brothers had begun very quietly to clean their guns. The next morning at first light, 4 riders came up the trail toward Bear Creek. Their leader was a hard man with a scarred face and a bandage on his right shoulder from a bear cub he had shot the year before, and his name was Zeke Rollins, and he carried a Spencer carbine across his saddle. Behind him rode 3 more men in long coats, all of them armed. They did not know that they were riding into a killing ground that had been laid out for them in the dark while they slept. Wyatt was waiting in the timber on the north side of the meadow. Silas was in the rocks above the trail. Cole was crouched behind the woodpile by the cabin with his Colt drawn, and a Sharps rifle leaning against the logs beside him. Eleanor was inside the cabin, locked in with the dogs, with strict orders not to come out for any reason short of fire. Zeke Rollins reined in his horse 50 yards from the porch. He cupped a hand to his mouth. "Hello, the cabin. Hollister. We have come for the girl. We have papers from the agency in Chicago. Send her out and we ride away peaceful. Make us come for her and there will be a different kind of mourning." For a long moment, there was no answer at all. Only the wind in the pines. Then Wyatt Hollister stepped out from behind a thick lodgepole at the edge of the meadow, and he raised his Winchester to his shoulder, and he spoke once in a voice that carried clear across the cold air. "There is no girl in this cabin, Mr. Rollins. There is only a question. The question is whether you 4 men intend to ride down off this mountain alive." Zeke Rollins smiled. He had time for exactly 1 smile. Then the shooting started, and 90 seconds later, 4 men lay dead or dying at the edge of the Bear Creek meadow. 3 of them would not see another sunrise. The 4th, Zeke Rollins himself, would be tied across the back of his own horse and sent down the mountain alive enough to deliver a message, but only just. Eleanor Whitmore stood at the cabin window with her hand pressed flat against the cold glass, watching 3 men walk out of the trees toward her with smoking rifles in their hands, and she understood for the first time in her 19 years on this earth what kind of country she had ridden into, and what kind of men she had ridden to, and what kind of woman she was going to have to become if she meant to stay. Zeke Rollins did not die clean. He took 2 of Wyatt's bullets through the chest, and 1 of Cole's through the meat of his thigh, and he was still breathing when Wyatt walked across the bloodied snow and stood over him with the Winchester pointed at his face. The other 3 lay where they had fallen, 2 of them dead before they hit the ground, the 3rd gurgling once and then going still. The horses had run off into the timber. The mountain had gone very quiet again, the way the mountain always goes quiet after a killing, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath and waiting to see whether the men were finished. Wyatt knelt on 1 knee beside the dying bounty hunter. He did not raise his voice. "You go back to Cobb, Zeke. You go back to Thorne. You tell them what you saw here this morning. You tell them that the woman is mine now, mine and my brother's. You tell them that if they want her, they will have to come up this mountain themselves. They will not send hired meat anymore. They will not use a girl as a fishing lure. That is the message. Repeat it back to me." Zeke spit blood. He stared up at the gray Montana sky, and he laughed once, a wet, broken laugh. "You think you are the wolf in this story, Hollister. You are the rabbit. You just do not know it yet." Wyatt thought about that for a moment. Then he stood up, and he reached down and he grabbed Zeke by the collar of his coat, and he hauled the man up onto his feet by main strength. Cole came over, and they lashed Zeke to the back of one of the recovered horses, belly down across the saddle, the way a man ties a deer he means to bring to butcher. Silas put the carbine across his shoulder and watched the trees while they worked. None of the brothers said anything more. There was nothing more to say. Wyatt slapped the horse on the rump. The animal trotted off down the trail with its bleeding cargo, headed back toward Helena. By the time Zeke Rollins reached the foot of the mountain, he would either be dead from the wound or alive enough to deliver the message, and Wyatt was content to let Providence decide which. Eleanor watched all of this from the cabin window. She did not turn away. She did not weep. She watched the way a woman watches a doctor cut a tumor out of someone she loves, with her hand pressed flat against the glass, and her breath fogging the pain, and her green eyes fixed wide and unblinking. When Wyatt walked back across the meadow toward the cabin, with his rifle hanging easy at his side, he looked up once, and he saw her in the window, and their eyes met across the snow, and something passed between them that neither of them had words for yet. She was not the same girl who had come up the mountain. She would never be that girl again. 2 weeks passed. The bodies of the 3 dead men had been buried in a shallow ditch on the far side of the meadow, well outside the boundary stones of the Hollister land, because Wyatt did not want their bones in his soil. The snow that had come with Eleanor came harder in the 2nd week of November, and then harder again, and the mountain closed itself off from the world below, and Eleanor Whitmore began to learn what it meant to be the only woman in a household of men who had been alone for a very long time. The work of the cabin became her work, not because the brothers asked it of her, but because she asked it of herself. She could not pay for the food she ate, or the bed she slept in, or the protection of the 3 rifles that hung above the door, and she could not bear to be a debt in any house, and so she rose before the sun, and she cooked the breakfasts, and she scrubbed the pans, and she carried in the firewood from the stack on the porch, and she learned to pluck a wild turkey, and she learned to skin a snowshoe hare, and she learned to render fat for soap in a black iron kettle by the side of the cabin. She also learned to fight. Wyatt began the lessons on the 3rd day. He took her out behind the cabin to a stretch of meadow where the snow had been packed down by the dogs, and he set up 6 empty whiskey bottles on a row of split fence posts at 20 paces, and he put a Winchester rifle into her hands. "This rifle will kill any man you point it at, Miss Whitmore. The trick is to want to point it at him before he points his at you. Tell me what you know about a rifle." "Nothing, Mr. Hollister." "Good, that is a clean place to start." He stood behind her. He set her feet in the snow at a slight angle. He pulled her shoulders square. He laid the stock against the hollow of her shoulder, and he showed her how to seat it there so that the recoil would push into the bone and not slap into the soft flesh of her arm. He cupped her left hand under the forestock. He guided her right hand to the lever and the trigger. He spoke into her ear in a low, patient voice that did not feel patient at all, that felt instead like the voice a hard man uses when he is teaching the only useful thing he knows. "You do not aim, you point. You look at the bottle. You see the bottle. You do not see the front sight. You do not see the rear sight. You look at the bottle until you can see the dust on it, and then you breathe out, and then you squeeze. Not pull, squeeze, like you are pinching a flea between your finger and your thumb. Now." The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and the first bottle vanished in a spray of brown glass and old whiskey and frozen snow, and Eleanor cried out half in shock and half in a feeling she had never had before, the feeling of having sent a piece of metal across 100 feet of cold air and broken something at the end of it with her own hand. Wyatt stepped back. He did not smile, but the corner of his mouth lifted by perhaps 1/8 of an inch. "You have a steady eye, St. Louis. You will do." Cole took over the pistol lessons on the 4th day. He was less patient than Wyatt and more theatrical. He spun his Colt around his finger to show off, and Eleanor laughed at him for the first time, a real laugh, not a polite one, and Cole grinned at her like a boy who had won something. He taught her to draw from her hip. He taught her to fire from the saddle. He taught her that a pistol is not a thing for distance, but for the moment, when distance has run out, when the man you are about to kill is close enough that you can smell the tobacco on his breath. she learned. Her hands took to the work the way some hands take to the piano. By the end of the second week, she could put 4 out of 6 pistol shots into a tin plate at 15 paces, and Cole whistled low and tipped his hat to her and called her a natural, and Eleanor blushed and looked away. Silas was the last to teach her, and what he taught her was not how to kill, but how to stay alive when killing came calling. He took her out into the timber in the gray light before dawn, and he showed her how to read the snow. He pointed at a faint disturbance under a fir tree and said, "Marten," and a deeper scuff, and said, "elk," and a long set of paired prints with the toes pointing in, and said, "mountain lion." And he told her that in this country, the man who could read the ground at his feet would always live longer than the man who could only read a book. He showed her how to set a deadfall trap. He showed her how to find dry tinder under wet snow. He showed her how to hide her tracks in a creek bed. He spoke very little, even when he was teaching. But Eleanor learned that Silas Hollister's silence was not the silence of a man who had nothing to say. It was the silence of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time, and who could not put it down even for an hour, and who had learned that the only way to keep carrying it was to stop using his mouth altogether. She wondered what it was. She did not ask. The body of the girl who had ridden up Bear Creek changed in those weeks. The orphanage had given her thin shoulders and a pale chest from years of indoor work, but the mountain gave her back something her body had been waiting for. Her cheeks took the wind and turned a color the orphanage had never allowed. Her arms grew firmer from the splitting of kindling and the lifting of water buckets. Her step grew longer, and her back grew straighter, and her copper hair, which she now wore in a single thick braid down the middle of her back, caught the firelight in the evenings and threw it around the room like a thing alive. The brothers noticed. They did not speak of it among themselves because the Hollister men did not speak of women in that way, but they noticed. Wyatt noticed in the careful, courtly way he had always treated her, the way he held the door for her, and stood when she entered a room, and tipped his hat when she carried out the slop bucket to the pigs. Silas noticed in the longer silences he kept when she was near in the way his eyes followed her across a room when he thought no one was looking. And Cole noticed in the way Cole noticed everything, which was to say openly, with his whole grinning face. It was Cole who first put his feeling into words, and he put it into words to his eldest brother, and not to Eleanor, because even Cole knew that some things had to pass between brothers before they could pass between a man and a woman. It happened on a December morning in the forge. Silas had gone out to the trap line. Eleanor was inside the cabin baking. Cole had come down to the barn to help Wyatt repair a broken wagon axle, and he stood in the doorway of the forge with his hands on his hips while Wyatt hammered a glowing length of iron on the anvil. "Brother, I need to say a thing to you." Wyatt did not look up. He brought the hammer down again. The iron flattened. The sparks flew. "Then say it." "I love her, Wyatt, the Whitmore girl. I have loved her since the morning she came up off the mud in front of the porch and pulled that crucifix out of her dress and told us to shoot her if we would not believe her. I have known it since that morning. I have kept it to myself because I am not a fool. But I will keep it to myself no longer. After this business with Thorne is finished, if I am still breathing, I mean to ask her to be my wife. I am telling you first because you are the head of this house. I will not act under your roof without your knowing." Wyatt set the hammer down on the anvil. He took the iron with the tongs, and he laid it back into the coals. He turned to face Cole, and he wiped the sweat off his forehead with the back of his wrist, and he looked at his youngest brother for a long moment. "She is not a horse, Cole. She is not a parcel of land. She is not mine to give and not mine to deny. If you mean to ask her, you ask her. If she says yes, I will stand at the wedding. If she says no, you will swallow it like a man, and you will not speak of it again. That is all I have to say on the subject." Cole grinned. It was the grin of a young man who has just been told he may try the dangerous thing he had already decided to try. "Fair enough, brother, fair enough." He turned to leave the forge. At the door he paused. "Wyatt, do you ever wonder why she was sent here? Why her of all the women in St. Louis? Cobb saw her at a charity supper," the man in Helena said. "Out of every pretty face in that city, his eye fixed on hers. You ever wonder why?" Wyatt looked at his brother. The fire of the forge played across the hard lines of his face. "Because some men cannot bear to see a thing that is good and not own it. That is all the reason there ever is. Now get out of my forge before you let the heat out." Cole laughed and went. Wyatt stood alone in the forge for a long time after his brother had gone. He looked into the coals. He saw an old face there that he had not let himself see in 9 years. He saw a woman with dark hair and a laugh that broke easily, and a way of saying his name that had once made him believe that a man like him could have a life like other men. He saw the shape of how that had ended. He picked up the hammer, and he brought it down on the anvil hard enough that the iron cried out, and he pushed the face back down into the coals where it belonged. The Christmas Eve of that year fell on a Wednesday, and the snow had laid itself thick and clean across the Bear Creek Valley, and the moon was full and rode high in a sky full of stars, so cold and so bright that they seemed to ring like bells when a man looked up at them. The brothers had brought in a fir tree and stood it in the corner of the main room of the cabin, and Eleanor had spent 2 days stringing it with dried cranberries and twists of yellow ribbon she had cut from one of her old petticoats. She had baked an apple pie from the dried apples in the larder, and she had roasted a young venison, and she had set the long plank table with the 4 tin plates and 4 tin cups, and the cabin smelled of cinnamon and gun oil and pine sap, and for the first time in any of their lives that any of them could remember, the cabin felt like a home. After supper, the brothers gave their gifts. Wyatt gave her a bone-handled knife in a leather sheath. The blade was 4 inches long and honed to a razor's edge, and the bone was scrimshawed with a small fir tree. He gave it to her without ceremony, simply laying it across her palm and closing her fingers over it. "For your boot. A woman in this country who does not carry a knife is a woman who does not respect her own life." Silas gave her a book. It was a small cloth-bound copy of the poems of Walt Whitman. The spine cracked and the pages dog-eared, and she understood without being told that it was his own copy, the one he had carried with him through the campaign of 76 and 77, and that he was giving her not a book, but a piece of his own silence rendered into print. She held the book against her chest, and she could not speak, and Silas only nodded and turned his face toward the fire. Cole gave her last. He had been waiting all evening, and his hands had been moving the whole time, fidgeting with his cup and straightening his collar, and Wyatt had watched him with a faint, dry amusement that he did not let show. When Silas had given his gift and gone back to his chair, Cole stood up, and he walked across the room to where Eleanor sat by the hearth, and he went down onto one knee in front of her. The room went very still. He held out his hand. In his palm was a thin silver chain, and on the chain hung a small pendant of beaten silver, and on the pendant he had hammered the shape of 2 mountains and a small flower between them. He had made it himself in the forge, working in the hours before dawn for 3 weeks, and the silver had come from an old $50 that had belonged to his mother. "Eleanor Whitmore, I am not a man with much. I have a cabin and a piece of mountain and 2 brothers who would give their lives for me, and that is the inventory of all my wealth in this world. But I have a heart that has been beating for you since the morning you came up out of the mud in front of this porch, and if you will have it, it is yours, and so is everything that comes with it. When this trouble with Thorne is finished, if I am still drawing breath, I am asking you now to be my wife. Will you have me?" Eleanor had not seen it coming, even though she had seen it coming for weeks. She felt the tears rise hot in her eyes, and she felt the silver chain cool in his open palm, and she felt the eyes of Wyatt and Silas on her from across the room, not pressing her, only waiting. She lifted her hand. She closed it gently around his. "Yes, Cole Hollister, I will have you." Cole closed his eyes. He let out a breath he had been holding for what looked like a year. Then he stood, and he lifted the chain over her head, and he settled it around her neck, and he leaned down and very slowly, very carefully, the way a man approaches something he is afraid of breaking, he kissed her. It was the first kiss of Eleanor Whitmore's life. It was nothing like she had imagined it from the books in the orphanage library. It was warmer. It was simpler. It was the kiss of a man who had decided and who would not be unswayed by anything the world might do to him afterward. When they parted, Wyatt was looking into the fire. Silas was looking at the floor. Both of them were giving the moment its privacy in the only way 3 men in one room could. Wyatt cleared his throat. He raised his tin cup of whiskey. "To the engagement. May the road from here to the wedding be shorter than the road behind us." They drank. The fire popped. Outside the cabin, the snow fell soft and white across Bear Creek. It was the last peaceful night any of them would have for a long time. The morning of December 28th came up gray and cold, and Wyatt rose before the others, as he always did, and he pulled on his coat and his boots, and he opened the front door of the cabin to step out and check the weather. He stopped in the doorway. He stood there for a full minute without moving. Carved into the heavy pine of the door, deep the wood pale and fresh against the dark stained surface, were words. The words had been cut sometime in the night while the brothers slept, and not one of the dogs had barked, and not one of the floorboards had creaked, and that fact alone told Wyatt everything he needed to know about the man who had done the carving. He read the words. Wyatt, new moon. I come with 30. Give up the bride or watch both your brothers die. Bo. Wyatt did not move for a long time. The wind played at the hem of his coat. The dogs sat on the porch and looked up at him and waited for whatever came next. The new moon was 7 nights away. Cole came up behind him. Silas came after Cole. Eleanor came last, drawn from the kitchen by the silence, and when she saw what was carved in the door, her hand went up to her throat and closed around the silver chain Cole had given her the night before. Cole's voice was tight. 3 of us against 30, brother. Those are not honest odds. Silas spoke quietly. Then we change the odds. I will go down to Helena tonight. I will find Captain Edmund Ashford. He rode with Wyatt in the '76 campaign. He owes Wyatt a debt, and he is the kind of man who has friends, and his friends are the kind of men who are still good with a rifle. I will bring back as many as I can. We will need at least 6. 8 would be better. Would be. Wyatt nodded slowly. His gray eyes had not left the carved letters in the door. "Go tonight. Take the gray horse. Stay off the main road. Trust no one in town except Ashford and the men he names. Be back here within 4 days. We have 7. Silas was gone within the hour. Eleanor watched him ride out from the kitchen window, and she thought the way a woman thinks at the start of a war that she had never seen a quieter man go to fight a louder fight. The 3rd night after Silas's departure, Brutus began to growl. It was a low growl, the warning growl, not the killing growl, and Wyatt was on his feet with the Winchester in his hands before Eleanor even understood that the sound had come from outside. Cole came out of his bedroom barefoot with his Colt drawn. Eleanor went to the window with the bone-handled knife from Christmas Eve in her hand. A single rider had come up to the edge of the meadow. He had stopped 100 yards from the porch. He sat his horse very still in the moonlight, and he held both hands up away from his body, palms forward, where they could be clearly seen. "Wyatt, it is me. I come alone. I am not armed. I have ridden 3 days to speak to you. I am asking for an hour of your time and a cup of your coffee and the chance to say what I came here to say. Then you can do with me what you decide." Wyatt stepped out onto the porch with the Winchester at his shoulder. The barrel did not waver. "You dare to ride up onto this land, Beauregard, after what you did. You have nerve I did not credit you with. I know what I did. I have known what I did every hour of every day for 5 years. I am not here to ask forgiveness for it. I am here to give you something better than forgiveness. I am here to give you the truth about what is coming in 4 nights, and I am here to give you the means to stop it. After that, you can shoot me where I stand. I will not raise my hand against you. You have my word, and I know what my word has been worth in the past, but it is what I have left." Wyatt held him in the rifle sight for a long moment. Then he lowered the barrel by an inch. "Get down off that horse. Slow. Walk to the porch with your hands where I can see them. If they leave my sight even once, the morning will find you in the snow." Beauregard Thorne dismounted. He walked the 100 yards to the porch with his hands held out at shoulder height, and Eleanor watched him through the window and saw a man perhaps 35 years old, with a hard, weathered face and dark hair gone gray at the temples, and eyes that looked as if they had not slept properly in a year. He looked, Eleanor realized, very like Wyatt. The same set of the jaw, the same way of holding his head. Half brothers, half blood. The unwanted half. Inside the cabin, Beau took the chair he was offered. He took the coffee Wyatt poured him. He looked at Eleanor for the first time, and a strange, small smile touched his mouth. "You are the bride, then. Cole Hollister's bride by the chain at your neck. He always did have better taste than the rest of us. I am glad of that, at least." Cole stood against the wall with his Colt in his hand and his thumb on the hammer. He did not speak. Beau took a long swallow of the coffee. He set the cup down. He laced his fingers together on the table. "I will keep this short. My father, Harrison Thorne, means to come up this mountain on the night of the new moon with 30 hired guns and Jeremiah Cobb at his side. That much you already know. What you do not know is that he means to kill me too." Cobb has been whispering in his ear. Cobb says that a man who turned on his own brothers once will turn again, and Cobb is not wrong, only early. My father has told the men that when the killing is finished at the cabin, I am to be left in the snow with the rest of you. He has decided I am no longer useful. I am to be a corpse the marshal can find when the spring thaw comes, and the story will be that the Hollister boys and their wayward brother killed each other in a feud, and Helena will mourn for a week and forget within a month. That is the plan. It is. Wyatt was very still. And how is it that you came by this knowledge, Bo? Because I was there when he said it. I was in the next room. He thought I had gone out. He spoke to Cobb without knowing I could hear. I rode out of Helena that same night. I have come straight here. I did not stop for sleep. Cole spoke for the first time. His voice was the kind of voice a man uses when he is one heartbeat away from killing. You burned Margaret Atwood alive in her father's house, Bo. I have not forgotten. I will not forget. There is no version of this conversation that ends with you walking out of this cabin on your own legs, so you can save the rest of your speech. Bo did not flinch. He looked at Cole, and he held his brother's eyes, and he nodded slowly. That night was the worst night of my life, Cole. I was drunk. I went to her father's smithy to argue about a debt I owed him, and I knocked over a kerosene lamp and the straw went up, and she was sleeping in the loft above, and I did not know she was up there. I tried to go back in for her. The smith broke my arm with his hammer to keep me from running into the fire. By the time we got the doors open, she was gone. I have lived with that every day. I am not asking you to forgive me. I am asking you to let me die in a way that means something. Let me help you stop my father, then put a bullet in me. That is the deal I am offering. Take it or do not take it. But decide, because the new moon is 4 nights from us and Silas is not back yet. Cole did not move. The colt did not waver. Eleanor saw the muscles standing out in the side of his neck. Wyatt set down his coffee cup. He looked at his half-brother for a long time. Cole, lower the pistol. We will keep him in the barn, chained, until Silas comes back. The 3 of us will decide together. That is how the Hollisters do these things. We will not break that for him. Cole's hand did not move for a long second. Then slowly, he eased the hammer down on the colt and slid it back into the holster at his hip. If he tries to leave that barn, brother, I will shoot him in the back. You will not stop me, not after Margaret. I will not stop you. They led Bo to the barn. They chained his right ankle to the iron ring set in the floor where the brothers tethered the team for shoeing. They left him a blanket and a bucket and a tin cup of water. Wyatt locked the barn door from the outside and pocketed the key. Silas came back on the 4th day riding hard up the trail from Helena, and behind him rode 6 men. Eleanor watched them come. She stood on the porch with Wyatt, and she counted the riders, and she felt a small, fierce hope rise up in her chest. The man at Silas's right shoulder was tall and lean, perhaps 50 years old, with a cavalry mustache going gray and the bearing of a man who had once worn officer's bars. That would be Captain Edmund Ashford. Behind him rode old Toby Whitfield, the one-legged soldier from the train who had heard from his daughter that a copper-haired girl had been seen riding into Bear Creek and had ridden the 80 miles up the mountain on a special saddle rigged to his stump because he said he owed her father a debt and her grandfather a larger one. Behind Toby came 4 more men whose names Eleanor would learn over the next 4 days. They were all old. They were all hard. They had all carried rifles in places where carrying a rifle meant something. When Silas swung down from his horse and saw the door of the barn padlocked, he turned to Wyatt. "Who is in the barn, brother?" Wyatt told him. Silas's face did not change. He walked to the barn. Wyatt unlocked the door. Silas stepped inside. He did not have his pistol drawn. He had something worse. He had a bowie knife in his right hand, and he had a stillness in his shoulders that Eleanor had never seen on him, and Wyatt and Cole followed him into the barn quickly because they knew, all 3 of them knew, that this was the moment that could undo everything. Bo was sitting against the post with his ankle in the chain. He looked up at Silas. He did not speak. Silas walked across the barn. He stopped 6 feet from his half-brother. He held the bowie knife at his side, point down. The lantern light flickered. Bo spoke first. "Margaret Atwood, I owe you that life, Silas. I have always owed you that life. If you mean to take mine for it, take it now. I will not raise a hand." Silas was silent for a very long time. The barn was so quiet that Eleanor, standing in the doorway behind Wyatt, could hear the breathing of the horses in the back stalls. When Silas finally spoke, his voice was lower than a whisper. "I have wanted to kill you for 9 years, Bo. I have built my whole silence around it. I have made a religion of it, and here you sit, and the moment is mine, and I find I do not want it. Not yet. Not until our father is in the ground. After that, you and I will sit down at the back of this barn, and we will settle our matter the way it must be settled. But not before, do you understand me?" Bo closed his eyes. A single slow tear ran down his weathered cheek. "I understand you, brother." Silas turned without another word and walked out of the barn. The bowie knife was still in his hand. He had not even raised it. That night, around the long plank table in the cabin, 10 men and 1 woman planned a battle. Bo, with the chain still on his ankle, drew the map. He drew it in pencil on the back of an old flour sack. He had been at his father's right hand for 5 years, and he knew every detail of the plan. 30 hired guns, 3 groups of 10. Cobb himself would lead the center group coming straight up the main trail to draw the brothers' fire. The east group of 8 would slip through the timber to flank. The west group of 7 would come up along the frozen creek bed where the cover was thinnest, but the approach was quietest. Harrison Thorne himself would hang back behind the timber line with 5 personal guards watching from a safe distance, the way he always watched, and he would only come forward when he was sure the fight was won. Wyatt studied the map for a long time. Then he began slowly to lay out the counterplan. Silas would take the east timber with the bear traps he had been forging for 10 days. Wyatt would take the north where Cobb himself would come. Cole would take the west, the creek bed, the place where the cover was thinnest, because Cole was the second best gun, and the west was the second worst position. Captain Ashford would take the loft with 2 riflemen, and they would have firing angles in all 4 directions. Old Toby and 2 more would hold the south side where the dogs ran. Eleanor would be inside the cabin with Bo. Bo would be unchained when the shooting started, and he would be given a Colt with 6 rounds, and he would defend the cabin door with Eleanor at his side, and if he turned the pistol on her or on any of the brothers, he would die in the next breath, but Wyatt did not believe he would. Captain Ashford had also done a thing none of them had asked for. Before riding out of Helena, he had quietly sent a wire to the office of Marshal Jasper Caldwell of the Montana Territory, with a single sentence written in the kind of code old soldiers still remember from the war. The wire said only that a serious matter would be settled at Bear Creek on the night of the new moon, and that any peace officer with a conscience might wish to be in the area by dawn. He had not told Wyatt. He had not told Silas. He had told no one because he had not wanted to argue about it. The captain did not believe in cleaning up his own messes when there were federal men paid to do it for him. He kept this to himself, and he sat at the table, and he drew his finger across the flour sack map, and he said nothing about the wire, and Wyatt, who had always known when Captain Edmund Ashford was holding something back, looked at him once across the table and decided not to ask. The night before the new moon, Cole and Eleanor sat by the fire alone after the others had gone to bed. The cabin was warm. The wind was high outside. Cole held her hand in both of his, and he looked into the flames for a long time before he spoke. "Eleanor, if the morning comes and I am not in it, I want you to promise me a thing." "Cole, do not." "I want you to promise me. I need to say it. Please." She nodded. She did not trust her voice. "If I am not in the morning, I want you to know that you are not to go back to that orphanage in St. Louis. Not for a day. Not for an hour. Wyatt will look after you. So will Silas. They have already given me their word on that, both of them separately without my asking. You will have a place in this house for as long as you want it. And one day, when the worst of the grief is past, you will find that you have a life of your own. I do not want you to spend it grieving a man you knew for 2 months. Promise me." Eleanor leaned forward. She put both of her hands on his face, on his bearded cheeks. She held his blue eyes with her green ones. "I promise you, Cole Hollister, but you are going to be in the morning. You are going to be in every morning. Do you understand me? You are going to be in every morning of my life until we are both old and our children are grown and our hair is white and the mountain has forgotten our names. That is what I promise you. The other promise you will not need." He kissed her. The fire popped. Outside, the wind came down off the Bitterroot Peaks, and somewhere far below the mountain, in the lights of Helena, 30 men were saddling 30 horses, and Harrison Thorne was buttoning a heavy black bear coat over a silk vest, and Jeremiah Cobb was checking the action of a nickel-plated pistol that had cost him $200 in Chicago, and the new moon was rising thin and pale and merciless above the valley, and the killing ground at Bear Creek was waiting. The new moon rose at 4 minutes past 11 on the night of the 7th of January, 1885, and it rose not as a moon at all, but as a thin, pale absence in the sky, a dark coin pressed against a darker velvet, and the stars above the Bitterroot Range burned white and hard and indifferent, and the snow on the ground threw back what little light the stars could give. The temperature stood at 25 degrees below zero. The wind had died at sundown and had not returned, and the mountain held a silence so complete that a man could hear the crack of a pine branch. A half-mile off the way, a man in a cathedral hears the cough of a stranger in the back pew. In the cabin at Bear Creek, 10 men and 1 woman waited for the killing to begin. Wyatt Hollister stood on the north edge of the meadow in a stand of lodgepole pines with 2 of Captain Ashford's men crouched behind boulders 10 yards to his left and 10 yards to his right. He carried the Winchester rifle that had killed 4 men in this same meadow 2 months earlier, and he carried his Colt revolver in a cross-draw holster, and he carried in the breast pocket of his coat a small daguerreotype of his mother that he had taken from her dressing table the night she died. He had not looked at the picture in 15 years. He carried it tonight because tonight was the kind of night a man carries the dead with him. Silas Hollister was in the eastern timber alone, except for Brutus the wolfhound, who lay flat on his belly in the snow beside his boots, with his ears laid back and his lips drawn slightly off his teeth. Silas had spent 4 days in those woods. He had set traps among the deer trails. He had cleared firing lanes through the brush. He had memorized every fallen log and every patch of black ice between the tree line and the cabin. He held a Sharp's .50 caliber buffalo rifle across his knees, and at his belt hung the Bowie knife he had not used in the barn. Cole Hollister crouched against the stones of the dry creek bed on the western flank of the cabin. He had 2 of Captain Ashford's men with him, both old, both quiet, both veterans of the Northern Plains campaign. The creek bed was the thinnest cover on the property. Wyatt had given Cole the worst position because Cole was the second best gun in the family, and the second best gun goes where the danger is greatest. Cole understood the mathematics of it, and he had made no objection. He held his Colt revolver in his right hand and a Sharps carbine across his back, and at his throat he had tied the same wool scarf Eleanor had knitted him during the first week of December, and the scarf still smelled faintly of her hair. Captain Edmund Ashford lay in the loft of the cabin behind the rough plank shutters of the upper window, with 2 riflemen flanking him, and from that height he could see every approach to the cabin, north and south and east and west, and he could put a bullet into any man who stepped into any of those approaches before that man had the chance to fire a second shot. The captain had not lain in a sniper's nest in 8 years. His joints ached. He did not mind. Old Toby Whitfield held the south side with his wooden leg planted in a snowdrift, and a Henry repeating rifle braced across a log, and beside him crouched 2 more of Ashford's men, and the dogs of the Hollister cabin patrolled the ground in front of them with the intelligence of soldiers who had been trained for this work since they were pups. Inside the cabin itself, in the warm orange light of the banked hearth, Eleanor Whitmore stood with her back to the south wall and her Winchester held at her hip. Across from her, against the north wall, sat Beauregard Thorne. The chain had been struck off his ankle 1 hour before. A Colt revolver with 6 bullets in the cylinder rested in his open hand. He did not look at the door. He looked at the floor between his boots, and he waited. The cabin was silent. The mountain was silent. The new moon climbed. The first sound came at 4 in the morning. It was the call of a great horned owl from the southern timber, a long, deep hoo, and any hunter on that mountain would have known at once that it was a man's voice and not an owl's, because the rhythm was wrong by a half-breath, and the third note dropped where an owl's would have held. Cobb's signal. The attack had begun. 12 men came up the north trail behind Jeremiah Cobb. They came on foot through the deep snow in a wide skirmish line, the way men come who have been promised that the enemy is sleeping, and the door is unlocked. They came under the false security of the carved warning on the Hollister door, the warning that had been meant to make the brothers run, the warning that had instead bought the brothers 7 days to prepare. The line moved through the lodgepole pines with the quiet competence of men who had done this work in mining camps and railroad strikes and Mexican border villages, and it moved straight into the place where Wyatt Hollister was waiting. Wyatt let them come within 40 yards. He let them come within 30. He let them come within 20, and at 20 he stepped out from behind the lodgepole, and he raised the Winchester to his shoulder, and he fired without speaking, and the first man in the skirmish line went down without ever having seen the man who killed him. The night came apart. 8 rifles opened up at once. Wyatt's 2 flanking men fired from their boulders. The skirmish line broke and went to ground in the snow, and the muzzle flashes lit up the timber like distant lightning, and the cracks of the rifles came back off the granite cliff behind the cabin in long, flat echoes that rolled away down the valley. Wyatt worked the lever of the Winchester with the easy rhythm of a man who had been firing rifles for 19 years, and a second man fell and a third, and the line that had come to murder him began very fast to die. Cobb himself rose up from the snow in the middle of the broken line and roared a curse that no living man heard clearly, and he charged forward through the timber with a nickel-plated pistol in each hand, firing as he came. 2 of his rounds found Wyatt's left shoulder, the upper meat of it, where the muscle is thick and a bullet passes clean through. Wyatt staggered. He did not go down. He swung the Winchester as a club because the lever had jammed against the cold and there was no time to clear it, and the steel of the barrel caught Cobb across the jaw, and the railroad baron from Chicago went into the snow on his back, and Wyatt was on him in a second, with the bone-handled Bowie knife from his belt. Cobb tried to raise one of the pistols. Wyatt's left hand closed around his wrist. They were close enough now that Wyatt could smell the pomade in Cobb's hair and the brandy on his breath, and Cobb's eyes were wide and white in the dark, and he looked for the first time in his life like a man who understood that money would not save him from what was about to happen. Wyatt drove the Bowie knife into Cobb's chest just below the breastbone. Once. He held it there until the eyes went still. Then he pulled the blade out, and he wiped it on the dead man's coat, and he stood up in the snow with blood running down his own left arm, and he looked around the field, and he counted 7 Cobb men dead, and 3 running, and 2 unaccounted for, and he understood that the North Trail was closed. In the eastern timber, Silas Hollister had not yet fired a shot. He did not need to. 8 men had come up through the trees from the east, moving along the deer trail Silas had memorized in 4 days of patient walking, and within the first 90 seconds of the fight, the bear traps had taken 5 of them. The screaming did not last long because Silas was not a man to leave wounded enemies behind to scream. He moved through the dark timber with the sharps in his hands and the Bowie knife at his belt, and he closed each man's account quickly and quietly, and Brutus took down the 7th man in a long, silent rush from the side that ended in a sound no human throat should ever have to make. The 8th man saw what was happening and turned and ran for the timber edge, and Silas watched him go for a moment and decided he was not worth a bullet. And then Brutus brought him down 40 yards into the trees, and Silas walked over and finished what the dog had started, and the eastern flank was closed. The western creek bed was where the trouble came. Cole Hollister and his 2 old riflemen took fire from 7 Thorne men at a range of 50 yards, and the cover along the dry creek was thin, just stones and a few stunted willows, and within the first 30 seconds of shooting, a bullet went through the throat of one of Cole's men, and that man fell forward into the creek bed with a wet sound and did not move again. Cole fired back. He brought down 3 of the 7 in the next minute. But 2 more of the 7 worked their way around the south end of the creek bed, where the cover ran out, and from there they had clear shots into Cole's position, and the 2nd of Cole's old riflemen took a bullet in the chest and a bullet in the leg and went down, and then it was Cole alone in the creek bed against 4 Thorne men closing fast. The first bullet that found Cole struck him high in the right thigh. He felt the impact like a horse kicking him, and his leg went out from under him, and he fell sideways against the cold stones of the creek bed, and the Sharp's carbine slid out of his hands. He scrambled for the Colt at his hip. He got it free. He fired twice. He hit the lead Thorne man in the chest at 20 yards, and the man dropped, but the 2nd Thorne man kept coming, and Cole's right arm had gone numb from the shoulder wound he did not yet know he had, and the Colt's hammer fell on a bad cap, and Cole understood in the space of a single heartbeat that he was about to die in a creek bed on the western side of his own cabin on the night of the new moon, and that Eleanor would have to live with the promise he had asked her to make. The Thorne man took aim. He never got to fire. A single rifle shot came from the south from far back along the timber line where old Toby Whitfield had been holding the south flank, and the Thorne man's head came apart in the cold air, and his body went down into the creek bed and stayed there. The fourth Thorne man saw what had happened and turned to run, and a second shot from old Toby's Henry rifle took him between the shoulder blades at 50 yards, and the western flank was closed. Cole lay in the creek bed and stared up at the cold stars above the Bitterroot, and he laughed once, and the laugh turned into a cough, and the cough brought up blood, and then old Toby Whitfield came stumping down on his wooden leg through the snow and rolled Cole onto his back and looked at the wounds and said in a flat, hard voice that Cole would live if they could get him to the cabin in the next 10 minutes, and the two of them began the slow, agonizing crawl across the meadow toward the porch. Inside the cabin, 3 Thorne men kicked in the back door. They had come up along the granite cliff behind the cabin where no one had thought to set a watch because the cliff had been judged unclimbable by the brothers in the planning. The Thorne men had climbed it anyway. They had used pitons and a rope, and they had come down onto the back porch in silence, and now they were inside the cabin with their pistols drawn, and Eleanor Whitmore stood with her back against the south wall and her Winchester at her hip, and Beauregard Thorne sat against the north wall with his Colt in his hand and his eyes on the door. The first Thorne man through the door saw the woman, and he saw the rifle, and he hesitated for the half-second. A man hesitates when he is looking at a copper-haired girl in the firelight, and his orders say he must not damage her. That half-second was the last half-second of his life. Eleanor squeezed the trigger the way Wyatt had taught her, the way a woman pinches a flea between her thumb and her finger, and the Winchester bucked into her shoulder, and the first Thorne man went down in the doorway with a hole through the center of his chest. She worked the lever the way Wyatt had taught her. She did not weep. She did not scream. She did not feel anything yet, because the feeling had not caught up to her body the way the sound of a far-off rifle does not catch up to the bullet. The second Thorne man stepped over the first man's body and raised his pistol toward Eleanor. Beauregard Thorne fired from the north wall. The bullet took the second Thorne man in the side of the head, and the man crumpled where he stood, and his pistol clattered on the floor planks, and before the third Thorne man could even register what had happened, Beau fired again, and the third man fell across the threshold with his arms thrown wide, and he did not move. The cabin went silent except for the ticking of the iron stove. Eleanor stared at Beauregard Thorne across the smoke-filled room. Her hand was steady on the rifle. Her green eyes were wet, but her hand was steady. Beau lowered the Colt slowly. 3 Miss Whitmore. The agreement was 6. I have 3 left. We are not finished yet. She nodded. She could not speak. She could not see what was happening outside, but she could hear it, and she could hear that the heaviest of the firing was over, and that what was left was the slow, careful work of men hunting other men through trees in the dark. Far back in the southern timber, Harrison Thorne sat his horse and watched. He was 60 years old, and he wore a heavy black bear coat, and around him stood 5 personal guards on foot with their rifles ready. He had watched the muzzle flashes in the north timber, and he had watched the muzzle flashes in the east timber, and he had watched the brief, sharp exchange in the western creek bed, and he had counted very carefully the rate at which his own men were dying, and he had understood by 5:30 in the morning that the night had gone wrong. He had ordered the assault on the cabin from the rear cliff because he had wanted insurance. The insurance had not paid. By the gray light of false dawn, Harrison Thorne understood that more than half of his 30 hired guns were dead in the snow at Bear Creek, and that Cobb was missing, and that the cabin still stood, and that the Hollister brothers were still alive, and that this was a thing he had not planned for in any of the long winter nights of his planning. He could have ridden away. The east and south trails were still clear. He had 5 guards. He had fast horses. He could have gone. He did not go. Pride in old men with old hatreds weighs more than sense. He had spent 5 years dreaming of the morning he would walk across the meadow at Bear Creek and put his boot on the chest of Wyatt Hollister and look down into the gray eyes of the man who had thrown him off this land, and he was not willing to give up that morning, even now when the morning had turned against him. He drew his pistol. He kicked his horse forward. He rode out of the southern timber alone, with his 5 guards walking behind him, and he came into the open meadow before the cabin in the gray January dawn, and he raised his voice to a shout that carried clear across the bloody snow. "Wyatt Hollister, come out and face me! I will not leave this mountain without you looking me in the eye. Come out, or I will burn every stick of this house while your bride is still inside it." Wyatt Hollister stepped out from the north timber. Blood ran down his left arm from the shoulder wounds. His Winchester hung in his right hand. He walked across the meadow at an easy pace, and he stopped 20 paces from the horse of his step-father, and he stood in the bloodied snow, and he looked up at the old man without speaking. Behind Wyatt slowly came Silas walking out of the eastern timber, with the sharps across his shoulder. Old Toby Whitfield came out of the south, leaving coal on the cabin porch, where Captain Ashford had come down from the loft to tend the wounds. 3 of the 4 surviving veteran riflemen stepped out of cover as well. They formed a slow, loose half-circle around Harrison Thorne and his 5 guards. Harrison Thorne looked at the half-circle. He counted. He understood that even with his 5 guards, the math no longer favored him. But pride. Wyatt Hollister, you and me, pistol and pistol, like men, the way our fathers settled their grievances. 20 paces, 1 shot. Whoever falls, falls. Whoever stands walks away free of all that has come before. Do you have the stomach for it, boy? Or have you become the kind of dog that shoots from ambush? Wyatt looked at the old man for a long time. Then he handed the Winchester to Silas without turning his head. He drew the Colt from the cross-draw holster at his belt, and he held it pointed at the snow. 20 paces, Harrison. Step down. Harrison Thorne smiled. He swung down from his horse with the slow, careful movements of a man whose body has begun to betray him, and he walked 20 paces from Wyatt across the bloody snow, and the 5 guards stepped back to give the old men room, and the half-circle of Hollister men stood very still, and the false dawn turned a shade paler in the eastern sky. The 2 men faced each other across the meadow. Harrison Thorne raised his pistol. A door slammed behind him, the cabin door. A figure stepped out onto the porch. Beauregard Thorne walked across the meadow with the Colt revolver in his right hand and 3 bullets left in the cylinder. He walked between the 2 men, and he stopped, and he turned to face his father. "Pa, lower the gun. It is over." Harrison Thorne did not lower the pistol. His face went very white in the gray light. His hand began slightly to tremble. "Beauregard, what in the name of God are you doing here? You were to be in Wyoming. Where are your men?" "I have no men, Pa. I came up here 3 nights ago to warn them, to warn my brothers, because I heard you tell Cobb that I was to die in this snow with the rest of them. I heard you say it through the wall of the office, Pa. You were going to put me in the ground with the men I came up out of with, your own son. And I had given you 9 years, Pa, 9 years of doing what you told me to do. And the price for those 9 years was a bullet at Bear Creek. So I came up here, and I told them everything, and I have been chained in their barn for 4 days, and tonight they unchained me, and I have killed 3 of your men inside that cabin to save the woman, and now I am asking you, Pa, I am asking you, lower the gun, drop it in the snow, let the marshal take you to Helena and let the law have its say. There has been enough killing on this mountain. You and I do not need to add to it. Please. Harrison Thorne stood with his pistol raised. His breath came out white in the cold air. His face worked through several different expressions, none of which his son had ever seen on it before, and then it settled finally into the face. It had always worn the face of a man who would rather break a thing than lose a thing. You are not my son, Beauregard. I see that now. You never were. He shifted the pistol. He pointed it at Beau. He fired. Wyatt Hollister was faster. The Colt in Wyatt's right hand came up and crashed once before Harrison Thorne could pull his own trigger a second time, and the bullet from Wyatt's pistol struck Harrison's right hand at the wrist, and the old man's pistol spun out of his grip and into the snow, and Harrison Thorne staggered back 2 paces, with the blood already pumping bright red from the shattered wrist, and he sat down hard in the snow, with a sound that was almost a sigh. But he had fired first, and his bullet had found its mark. Beauregard Thorne stood swaying for a moment with both hands pressed against his stomach. Then he sat down very slowly in the bloody snow, and he looked across the meadow at his half-brothers, and he smiled a small, tired smile, and he lay down on his back and looked up at the gray dawn sky. Wyatt was beside him before the body had finished settling. "Beau, brother, hold on. Hold on. We will get you in the cabin. Captain Ashford has been a field surgeon. He can stop the bleeding." Beau shook his head. He coughed. Blood came up. "No, Wyatt, not this one. Belly shot at 12 paces, not this one." Silas knelt down on the other side of him. He took Beau's right hand in both of his own. His face had no expression at all that anyone could have read. "Beau." "Silas, I owe you a life. I am paying it now. Will you take it from me?" "I will take it, brother." "Then take my hand for 1 minute. That is all I ask. 1 minute." Silas Hollister held his half-brother's hand for 1 minute by the old pocket watch in his vest, and during that minute, Beauregard Thorne did not speak again, and at the end of the minute, Beau's eyes were still open, but they were no longer seeing the sky, and Silas closed them gently with his thumb, and then he bowed his head, and he wept very quietly for the first time in 9 years. Cole had been carried into the cabin. Eleanor was at his side. Captain Ashford had cut away the trousers from the right thigh and was working with a probe and a pair of forceps and a bottle of iodine, and the captain's hands were as steady as they had been at Cold Harbor in 1864, and he was telling Cole in the calm, dry voice, old soldiers reserve for badly wounded younger men, that the bullet had missed the artery and the bone, and that Cole would walk again, possibly with a limp, but that he would walk. The shoulder wound was cleaner. The shoulder wound would heal. Eleanor held Cole's left hand in both of hers. She did not speak. Her face was pale and smudged with powder smoke, and a small spray of dried blood across her cheek that was not hers. Her copper hair had come loose entirely from its braid and hung damp around her shoulders. Her green eyes did not leave Cole's face. When Wyatt came in through the door with the news about Beau, Cole closed his eyes for a long moment. He opened them. He looked at his eldest brother. He earned it, Wyatt. Whatever he was before, he earned it tonight. He earned it, Cole. We will bury him with our mother. Marshal Jasper Caldwell rode up the trail at full gallop with 8 deputies behind him, at 7:30 that morning, 2 hours after the last shot had been fired, having ridden through the night from Helena on the strength of Captain Ashford's quiet wire. He took one look at the meadow at Bear Creek, and he took one look at Harrison Thorne sitting in the bloody snow with his shattered wrist bound up in a strip of his own coat, and he took the long, careful statements of every Hollister brother and every Ashford rifleman and Eleanor Whitmore herself, and by mid-morning he had Harrison Thorne in irons across the back of a horse and was riding back down the mountain toward Helena. The trial of Harrison Thorne lasted 4 days in late February. He was convicted on charges of conspiracy to commit murder fraud against the Western Bride Society, the operation of a forged correspondence, and 27 counts of accessory to assault with intent. He was sentenced to 30 years at the territorial prison at Deer Lodge. He was 60 years old at his sentencing. The sentence was understood by every man in the courtroom to be a death sentence by another name, and Harrison Thorne understood it too, and he did not appeal because he had nothing left to appeal with. Jeremiah Cobb was buried in a pauper's grave outside Helena because no one in Chicago came to claim the body, and the railroad investors who had once jumped at his name now found that they could not remember it. The 4 Thorne men who had fled into the timber were never seen again in Montana territory. 2 of them surfaced years later in San Francisco under different names and were hanged there for separate crimes. The other 2 vanished entirely the way men vanish in the West when the West is finished with them. 2 of Captain Ashford's veteran riflemen had died in the battle. They were buried in the small Hollister family plot under the lodgepole pines on the southern slope of Bear Creek with the brothers' father and mother, and with Beauregard Thorne and Captain Ashford himself read the words at the graveside, and Eleanor Whitmore stood beside Cole, who stood on a cane, and she held his arm to keep him steady, and the first thaw of the Montana spring began in the soil under their feet that very afternoon. The wedding took place on the 17th of May, 1885. The snow was gone from the meadow at Bear Creek. The snowmelt had run down through the creek beds and the rivers below. The lodgepole pines stood tall and green, and the wildflowers had come up across the south-facing slopes, edelweiss and lupine and Indian paintbrush, white and blue and orange, and the high air smelled of pine sap and wet earth and the sweetness of new grass. Wyatt had ridden down to Helena 6 weeks earlier with a sum of money saved across 9 years of trapping, and he had sat with the wife of a tailor on Last Chance Gulch, and together they had selected a length of white silk and a length of fine French lace, and the tailor's wife had taken Eleanor's measurements from a letter Wyatt had carried in his coat, and she had sewn a wedding gown the like of which had not been seen in Helena in many years. Wyatt had paid for the gown without complaint, and he had ridden it back up the mountain in a cedar trunk strapped to a pack mule, and he had given the trunk to Eleanor on the 1st of May without a word of explanation, and Eleanor had opened it and had sat down on the edge of the bed in the small room that had once been Wyatt's mother's, and she had put her face in her hands and wept. On the morning of the wedding, she stood on the porch of the cabin at Bear Creek in that white silk dress with the silver chain Cole had given her at Christmas around her neck, and her copper hair swept up under a wreath of lupine and edelweiss that Silas had picked himself in the dawn light and woven into a crown for her. Father Liam O'Connell had come up from Helena the day before riding an old bay mare with his Roman collar slightly askew and a leather satchel containing the holy oil and the prayer book and a small bottle of communion wine. He stood now under the great lodgepole pine at the south end of the meadow where the brothers had cleared a small altar of stones, and he watched the bride come down the porch steps on the arm of Wyatt Hollister. Cole stood beside Father O'Connell with a polished oak cane in his right hand. The thigh would never be quite the same. The shoulder ached when the weather changed. He had been told he would not run again, and he had said that he had never much enjoyed running anyway. He stood waiting for his bride with his blue eyes shining and his honey-colored hair washed and combed for the first time in many weeks, and a clean white shirt borrowed from Captain Ashford because Cole had never owned a clean white shirt in his life. Silas stood at his brother's side as the witness. Silas had cut his beard for the occasion. He smiled. It was the second time anyone had seen him smile in the 8 months Eleanor had known him. Wyatt walked his bride across the meadow. When they reached the altar, Father O'Connell looked up from his prayer book. "Who gives this woman?" Wyatt Hollister looked at the priest. Then he looked at his youngest brother. Then he looked at Eleanor Whitmore, the copper-haired girl who had ridden up out of the mud in front of his porch on a rainy October afternoon 8 months before with nothing in the world but a forged letter and her father's silver crucifix, and who had become in the months that had followed the only sister he was ever likely to have on this earth. He placed her right hand into Cole's left. "I do, Father. I give my sister into the keeping of my brother, and Cole. You will protect her with your life. You will earn her every day. You will never give her cause to regret the morning she chose you. Do you swear it?" "I swear it, Wyatt, to my last breath." The priest read the rite. The rings were exchanged. Cole had hammered them himself from the gold of an old half-eagle he had carried in his pocket for 9 years, and the rings were thick and rough and beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they have been made by the hand of a man who loved the woman he made them for. They kissed. Captain Ashford fired his pistol 3 times into the air. The dogs barked. Father O'Connell pronounced them man and wife in the eyes of God, and the territory of Montana, and the meadow at Bear Creek, which had seen so much killing, saw also, on that May morning, a thing that was the opposite of killing, and the lodgepole pines stood watch. 20 years passed. Bear Creek became a ranch. Cole and Eleanor took the original cabin and added rooms to it as the children came, until it had grown into a long, low house with 6 bedrooms and a wide front porch that ran the length of the southern face. Wyatt built a smaller house of his own, a 1/4 mile up the slope, where he could see the meadow from his front window. Silas built a 3rd house near the creek with a forge attached. And in 1888 he married Charlotte Ashford, the daughter of the captain who had come up the mountain on the night of the new moon. And they had 2 children of their own in the years that followed. The land grew. 200 acres in 1885 became 400 by 90, and 400 became 1,000 by the turn of the new century, and the Hollister name became a name that meant something in western Montana, a name that meant honor and silence and a long memory, and the kind of cabin door that opens to a stranger in honest trouble. Cole and Eleanor had 5 children. Edmund Hollister, born in 1886, named for Captain Edmund Ashford, who had ridden up the mountain on the night of the new moon, grew tall and dark like his uncle Wyatt, and went east at 18 to study medicine. Catherine Hollister, born in 1888, named in honor of Eleanor's own mother, who had died in the cotton mill fire, and whom no one in this country had ever known, grew up to teach school in Helena. Tobias Hollister, born in 1891, named for the one-legged soldier who had pressed a folded paper into Eleanor's hand on a westbound train, grew up to take over the ranch. Wyatt Hollister, Jr., born in 1894, named for the only true brother his mother had ever known, grew up to be a quiet man with gray eyes who did not laugh often, but who loved deeply and who would carry the Hollister name into the new century. Rose Hollister, born in 1897, came into the world with her mother's copper hair and was the joy of every room she ever entered. On a September afternoon in 1905, Wyatt Hollister sat on the porch of the long, low ranch house at Bear Creek with a tin cup of coffee in his hand. He was 53 years old. His hair had gone entirely white. His beard was the color of new snow. The shoulder wound from the night of the new moon had stiffened with the years, and he could no longer raise his left arm above his head, but he could still ride, and he could still shoot, and he could still split a whiskey bottle on a fence post at 20 paces with the old Winchester, and he counted that enough. Silas sat beside him in the second rocking chair. He was 51. His scar had faded to a thin, pale line. He spoke more often now than he had in the old days, and he laughed sometimes, and there was a peace about him that had taken 20 years, and a wife and 2 children, and the bones of Beauregard Thorne under the lodgepole pines to bring into his face. Cole came up onto the porch from the south meadow, moving with the slight lurch that the bullet in his thigh had given him for life, leaning on the same polished oak cane he had carried at his wedding. He was 48. He still grinned. He had grinned every day of those 20 years, and the grin had not wearied, and Eleanor said it was because Cole Hollister was the only man in the Bitterroot Range who had figured out the secret of being happy, which was simply to keep choosing to be happy every morning, whether the world earned it or not. Eleanor came out through the screen door behind him with a plate of fresh apple pie. She was 39. Her hair was still copper with 3 thin streaks of silver at the temples that she made no effort to hide. The freckles were still there across the bridge of her nose. The green eyes were still the green of a high mountain meadow in June. She wore a pale yellow dress that she had sewn herself, and she carried herself with the unhurried, easy grace of a woman who had built her own life out of rough timber and refused ever since to apologize for any board of it. She set the pie on the small porch table. She poured herself a cup of coffee. She sat down on the porch rail with her back against the post and her bare feet tucked under her, and she looked out across the meadow where the autumn aspens were turning gold against the dark green of the lodgepole pines. Wyatt rocked slowly in his chair. "Eleanor, do you remember the morning you came up out of the mud in front of this porch?" Eleanor laughed. It was a low, rich laugh that filled the porch like honey filling a jar. "I remember a frightened girl of 19 who had ridden a stolen horse for 24 hours through a forest she had never seen, carrying a letter that turned out to be a forgery." Cole reached over and took his wife's hand. "The best forgery anyone ever wrote." Silas smiled into his coffee. "Sometimes the lie of an enemy turns out to be the greatest blessing of a lifetime." The 4 of them were quiet for a while. The wind in the lodgepole pines made a sound like a long, slow breath. Somewhere down in the south meadow, the children of Cole and Eleanor and the children of Silas and Charlotte were running through the autumn grass, and their voices came up faint and bright on the wind, and Brutus, the second son of the first Brutus, lay asleep on the planks at Wyatt's feet. The sun went down behind the western peaks. The light went red, and then gold, and then purple, and the long, low ranch house at Bear Creek stood against the coming evening with its windows lit warm and yellow, and the smoke rose from the chimney straight up into the still autumn air, the way smoke rises when a country has finally stopped fighting itself. Eleanor set her empty coffee cup on the porch rail. She looked at the three men she loved, the brother who had given her away, the brother who had taught her silence, and the husband who had given her a life. She looked at the meadow that had been a killing ground and was now a pasture where her children played. She looked at the mountain that had once been the most terrifying place on earth and was now the only place she had ever called home. She did not speak. There was no need to. The new moon would rise again that night, thin and pale and merciless above the Bitterroot. But it would rise over a different valley than the one it had risen over 20 years before, and the men and women on the porch of the ranch house at Bear Creek had earned at last the right to watch it climb without fear. The mountain hummed its old song. The night came down. The lights in the windows of the long, low house burned warm and steady, and they would go on burning, and the Hollister name would go on, and the copper-haired girl from the St. Louis orphanage, who had once been sold for $300 American, had become in the slow turning of 20 Montana years the matriarch of a dynasty that no banker in Helena and no railroad baron in Chicago and no 30 hired guns on any new moon could ever have unmade. The story ended where every good Western story ends, on a porch, at sundown, with the surviving men silent and grateful, and the woman they had all in their different ways been saved by looking out across the country they had bled for and finding it good. The end.